It's now been more than a year since October 7th when Hamas attacked the Israeli Nova Music Festival. More than 1,200 people were killed and militants took more than 250 people hostage. About 100 of those still surviving hostages have yet to be released. In the years since that horrific attack, there's been renewed warfare in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, leaving at least 41,000 people dead, with many more missing and believed to be gone. The majority of those killed civilians, and now thousands more killed in Lebanon as the bombing expands. But this conflict dates back more than a century, a fact felt closely by those in Israel, Palestine, and here in Connecticut. We spoke with several local people, many exclusively, about the toll this year and this conflict has had on them. These are their stories.
Well, I got a phone call from my cousin who lives in kibbutz in the north. And he said, Liat and Aviv have been taken.
Jerry Fisher, a Waterford resident, replays October 7th often.
It was both paralyzing and galvanizing.
His cousin's son-in-law, Aviv, was killed. The family only found out after remnants of Aviv's body were found on the tip of a bullet.
His body is still in Gaza. We despair for him, but we despair even more for all the living hostages that are still there. We need a ceasefire.
Fisher's cousin Yehuda spoke with Fox 61 from Israel, telling us not just about Aviv, but his daughter, Liat. Liat was taken hostage that day, but among the first released in November, thanks to Jerry and Congressman Joe Courtney's work with the State Department.
Liat, I think that she's very special. You need to understand, she grew up in the kibbutz. She grew up on a farm.
Liat grew up to be a wife and mother, serving her mandatory time in the Israeli forces where she met her husband, Aviv. She then became a history teacher, determined to promote peace and understanding. She says her students are what carried her through, and strong diplomatic negotiation is what brought her home.
The experience that Liat went through, she would not have been released if there wasn't diplomacy, if there was not negotiation that took place, and that both sides stepped up and actually agreed to a structure.
Now Liat's returned to her classroom, sharing what happened to her while also speaking with officials working on ceasefire negotiations.
She's careful not to demonize all Gazans, and the family that held her as a hostage treated her well. That's not to say that everybody's been treated well. Believe me, most of them have not been treated well. And she doesn't give up on a vision for a peaceful Middle East.
A future not widely agreed upon and one that's been out of reach due to a complex past.
My daughter's a history teacher. That's not a coincidence. Everything that led up to that attack, the fault was Bibi Netanyahu and his Likud party and their politics. Netanyahu thought he could manage the Palestinians with a divide and rule tactic between the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Hamas in the Gaza Strip. But this is not going to stop. There are 14 million people living between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. Nobody's going.
An orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Ali Elaydi, was scrubbing in on October 7th at Yale New Haven Hospital.
I didn't think too much of it. There is always tension in the area.
But before he could finish his shift, he understood this was different.
This is going to be bad. This is the first time there has been an attack from the Palestinian side to this level.
The beginning of all-out warfare in the region and an even worse humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip, where Elaydi is from.
I was talking to my family, and they were saying that this is the worst thing that they've ever experienced.
His family says the bombardments and aid blockades are worse than in the 1948 Nakba, when they were forced from their homes into Gaza. Elaydi was born there, but his family was granted political asylum here.
I think most Palestinians growing up in the United States are afraid to be vocal, afraid to be labeled as sympathizers.
He's become an awarded surgeon, motivated by his roots. He says the Gaza healthcare system was already in ruins far before October 7th. Now no hospitals in Gaza are fully functioning. That's why Dr. Elaydi immediately applied for medical mission and headed back home.
I knew that I needed to go back. I knew that This was my calling.
Other Palestinians and Arab Americans watched from afar, rallying support locally, like Jenna Raba on UConn's campus.
So many students don't even know what Palestine is.
Raba was the president of the university's Students for Justice in Palestine group for 4 years. Long before October 7th, Raba's worked to get Palestine's needs seen. She's a first-generation daughter of Palestinian refugees who were born in a camp. When we spoke with her, she just learned both her uncle and cousin were killed in an Israeli airstrike.
Constant generational struggle because this military is relentless and this regime is brutal. It's a history of struggle. It's a history of pain and death and slaughter, despite all the good parts of it. Palestinians are the most welcoming, hospitable, friendly people you'll ever meet.
That culture beyond the decades of fighting is something she's trying to share. It's why she helped lead UConn's encampment, joining the nationwide student movement for ceasefire and divestment.
The encampment was one of the most formative experiences of my life.
Raba was arrested in April.
I went in expecting that I was going to get arrested. It checks in with everything that we've been through my 4 years at UConn of being suppressed and silenced.
Tired of those feelings, Basil Al-Najjar spent years chanting in the streets, creating space for educational conversations, and bringing together Arab Americans in Connecticut. Al-Najjar's mom was born in Jerusalem post-1948 after Israel was established. From those in Gaza to the West Bank to those living in Israel, Al-Najjar says they've never been treated equally.
The first thing that I immediately saw were the fear tactics that have been thrown onto us for the past 76 years. When I walked in, there were guns pointed at my face. My family didn't have any voter rights. My family wasn't able to move freely within their own land.
A land already beaten by warfare, resources stripped, and many living in tent camps or other vulnerable infrastructures. That's what Dr. Elaydi went back to, finding them even worse off.
They were closing down the borders. They were not allowing food in. They were not allowing aid in. My cousin needed an amputation and refused the amputation because there wasn't anesthetic medications. There was a doctor who had to amputate his daughter's leg, not using any medications because there wasn't allowed anything in. I mean, I've been on mission trips before and never have I experienced this amount of limited resources. It was a 200-bed capacity hospital that was housing 35,000 refugees, and we were treating over 5,000 patients. Even if the patient didn't die from the direct bombing and bullets from Israel, they would eventually die from the injuries. And that was something that you knew that you could take care of given the resources. And there are patients where you have to decide, this patient's probably not going to make it. And so are you going to use the resources to get them out, or you have to use the ambulance because there's only such a limited supply of ambulances and cars? If they were in a different area in the world, that they would be saved and they would still be alive. There was an 8-year-old kid who was involved in a blast injury. He was rushed into the ED, and I was actually in the ED at the time. The mom and dad were panicking because the kid had his bone sticking out of his thigh, and he also had a broken jaw. And the parents are talking to me like, do everything that you can for him, do everything that you can for him. And I tell them, I'm going to do everything I can for your child. I'm going to fix him. I'm going to do whatever we can. But you don't know if you're going to be able to save this child. You don't know if you can guarantee success.
Elaydi has now also been denied re-entry. Already waiting at the border in Jordan, he was told by Israeli officials he will not be allowed back in to help.
Whenever you decide to limit the amount of food, limit the amount of aid to 2 million people living in this area, it's very intentional. Not everyone is Hamas. Not everyone is fighting.
Arab and Islamic student activists with their allies established encampments, held rallies, and blockaded streets.
We're witnessing the slaughter of children, men, women, and children before our eyes. I'm sorry you can't get to your job on time, but these are the types of disruptions that we need to have in order to bring this to the attention of our policymakers who are ignoring us.
Pratt & Whitney just received more federal funds as the sole producer of the F-135 engines the IDF uses.
I know most of my classmates will be employed by Electric Boat, Lockheed Martin, Pratt & Whitney, Raytheon.
The exact companies that are bringing bombs down upon our families, that are creating the warships that are destroying Gaza. that are making the bombs that are completely eradicating our land.
Beyond divestment, activists want Congress to put conditions on aid to Israel or stop it altogether.
We're talking about $18 billion in aid have been given to Israel in the past year and $250 billion in total over the past 76 years. That specific money can go to curing the homelessness situation in America. It can go to eradicate hunger in America. It can go to make education free in America.
While activists plead for Congress to hear them, those in the chambers have continued to take a down-the-middle approach, calling out civilian casualties, but saying Israel can still be one of America's strongest allies. Some have taken aim instead at already controversial Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Connecticut's own Senator Chris Murphy recently warning President Biden Netanyahu was possibly turning down ceasefire deals to influence the upcoming election. Courtney, who's an advocate of the defense industry here in Connecticut and who had to secure Liat's safety, tells us diplomatic negotiations for a ceasefire, however difficult, are the path forward.
Connecticut has a long tradition of, supplying our military, going back really to George Washington, and I think actually it's a proud tradition. In my opinion, the policy that the U.S. has pursued there is about sort of protecting sovereignty of nations, providing defensive equipment, Iron Dome equipment that again is really about trying to protect a population from what happened on October 7th. When the time comes where I think the two main adversaries realize that that pathway of fighting is just exhausted, that's when I think the diplomatic effort's going to step in and create a framework. There's real human beings that are affected by this.
Human beings who here in Connecticut will soon be heading to the polls, like this protester who disrupted a 5th District congressional debate this past week.
Both of these people support genocide!
Many feel not represented by their current Capitol Hill delegation or their challengers. The war has become part of campaign conversations. In that recent debate, Congresswoman Yehuda Beinin went on to say she supports aid to Israel, but with conditions.
I am the only person on this stage who has even acknowledged the suffering of the Palestinian people. Mr. Logan has never even acknowledged that there are people in the Gaza Strip that are suffering, that have been displaced, children who are dying. That has to be a part of the solution. So I understand that people are passionate about this issue, but they have a reason and a right to be passionate about this.
Her challenger, Republican nominee George Logan, responding,
Israel has a right to defend itself. Absolutely, war is terrible. It's terrible on everyone involved, and on both on the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side. There are innocent people who are suffering. I want the war to end as soon as possible. I believe in a two-state solution. Absolutely.
Even those within the same political parties don't agree or feel seen. We spoke after the Democratic National Convention with Issam Beret, an academic, advocate, and political refugee at the DNC as a Democratic delegate. But his ceasefire banner and protests for Palestine left Beret feeling like he had no representation, even in the party's so-called big tent.
We were beaten by stick, and we were pushed. We were asked to run, to leave, and people were screaming at us that's like, this is not your place, get out of here. It's like, really? If the Democratic Convention is not my place, so where is? I couldn't understand that. To me, it was very important to make my voice heard because I do believe it's very healthy and it's very important than any time before that Democrats have internal discussions and internal debate over concerning issues, especially during the convention process.
I don't feel seen by the U.S. government or by politicians or anything like that, because I'm literally waiting to get another phone call to hear who of my family members have been killed by another Israeli missile.
While disruption and division continue this election cycle, Liat's father shared with us some hope.
There are a surprisingly large number of Israelis who agree that the solution to the Palestinian problem does not have to include fighting.
After his daughter was returned in the November hostage deal, he got to work with an organization bringing Israelis and Palestinians together to talk what peace could and should look like. Members of that group drafted a ceasefire deal, which lays out longer-term plans for the region. Hamas has actually agreed with it, and it would bring back all remaining Israeli hostages taken October 7th. Now he's waiting for it to be officially put on the table.
We all need to recognize the humanity of the other. We don't necessarily have to love each other.
One of my cousins is lost under rubble right now, and we don't know if he's alive. But I have to operate like everything is normal and everything is fine.
I mean, we're going through the Jewish high holy days now. Usually you say to a good year. And this year we're saying Shana Yoter Tova, to a better year, because the last year was horrible.
For more of our coverage, you can always head to fox61.com or download the free Fox 61 News app. We're committed to covering the policy and, most importantly, the people facing this war.